Before you hear this story, I want you to picture something. A woman standing waist-deep in a spring flood, with a boy's coat sleeve in one fist and a tin box floating away from the other. Two things within reach, only one pair of hands. Everything that happens afterward, the whispers, the courthouse, the men who said she didn't belong on land she'd buried her husband in, all of it comes down to which one she let go of. I was there. I was standing on the bank with dry boots and a good horse, and I did nothing at all. That's not a confession I make easily. But I've carried a ledger my whole life, a little pocketbook where I write down what I owe folks, and hers is the longest page in it. Some debts you can't square with money. So stay with me. Because the ending isn't what the town expected, and it isn't what she expected either. And I promise you, the richest man in 3 counties walked into that courthouse and said 7 words nobody in Bellwether, Colorado ever thought they'd live to hear. This is her story. I only saw it. The cutthroat came up in the night, and nobody rang the bell. That's the first thing. Somebody was supposed to ring the bell at the ford. That was Ott Renwick's job, or the county's, or God's, depending who you asked afterward, and no bell rang. So at 7:30 on a green May morning in 1893, Fen Mabry drove a loaded freight wagon into water that had been ankle-deep on Tuesday, and was now the color of coffee and moving like a train. I was on the North Bank. I'd come down to shoe a mule, and I was late, and being late is how I came to be standing there with a rasp in my hand, watching a wagon go sideways. It didn't crash. That's what people get wrong when they tell it. There was no great smash. The near wheel found a hole, the wagon leaned like a man deciding to sit down, and then the current took the box and turned the whole thing over with a slowness that I still dream about. Slow, almost polite. The tarp bellied up. Crates went out of it like teeth out of a jaw. Mabry came off the seat and was gone downstream, and then not gone, hung up in the willow snag 40 feet on, coughing. And under the tailgate, pinned, one arm out of the water and moving, was his boy. Cully Mabry, 11 years old. Freckles like somebody had thrown gravel at him. He used to bring me apples that he'd stolen from his own root cellar, which is a thing I never had the heart to tell him wasn't stealing. I want to be honest with you about what I did in the next 4 seconds, because everything I say after this depends on you believing I'll tell it straight. I did nothing. I stood in the mud with a horseshoe rasp in my right hand and my mouth open, and I did nothing. I have thought about it for a long time, and I don't think it was cowardice exactly, or not only. It was the size of it. Some things are so much bigger than you that your body just waits for a bigger man to come. A bigger man didn't come. She came. She'd been riding the ridge trail above the ford, coming down with a string of 2 horses and a saddlebag over her shoulder and a Japan tin box under her arm, and I saw her come off that ridge at an angle no sensible person would take a horse down. She hit the bottom, dropped the lead rope, and went into the water at a dead run. Now I have to say her name, and I have to do it carefully. The town called her the Das woman when it was being civil. It had other names for her, and I won't write them. She'd married Eli Das, a packer out of Trinidad, in 1888, and she'd buried him in 1890, one up on the meadow he'd proved, and she was Chiricahua. One of the ones that never went to Florida, one of the ones nobody could ever explain the paperwork on, which in Bellwether was the same as saying she had no paperwork at all. Eli called her Dahe. I asked her once how it was properly spelled, and she looked at me a long moment and said, "It isn't spelled. It's said." So Dahe is how it sounded to me, and if I've got it wrong, that's mine to carry, and I've got it in the ledger. She went into the cutthroat with the tin box still under her arm. I think about that too. She didn't set it down. She didn't have time to think this is a flood, I should set down the deed to my land. She just ran the way you run with whatever's in your hands. The water took her legs at 10 feet out. She went under and came up further down than she meant to, and I heard her make a sound, not a scream, a kind of grunt, the noise a person makes lifting something too heavy. She got a hand on the wagon's upturned running gear and dragged herself along it. And there she was, boy's sleeve in one fist, tin box in the other. The tailgate had him, not crushing him, pinning, the whole weight of the wagon working its way slowly onto his chest as the current shoved the box downstream. His face was up. His face was above the water by about the width of my thumb. To lift the tailgate she needed both hands. I saw her look at the box. I have described that look to maybe 3 people in my life and never once got it right. It was not anguish. That's the wrong word, and it's the word people want. It was a kind of arithmetic, a quick, cold, terrible sum, done in the space of a breath, by a woman who had already done sums like it before and knew exactly what they cost. She opened her hand. The box went. It bobbed once, gold letters catching, E-DOS, and then it was a dark shape in brown water, and then it was nothing. She got both hands under the tailgate, and she stood up. 11-year-old boy, 100 pounds of oak and iron and a river pushing. She stood up out of the cutthroat like something coming out of the ground, and the wagon moved maybe 8 inches, and she held it there, with her head back and the cord standing in her throat, long enough for Cully Mabry to slither out from under it on his back like an otter. Then the wagon came down and took her under with it. That's when I moved, too late to matter. I got a rope on the willow snag, and I got Finn Mabry out, and I got the boy, who was blue and shaking and vomiting river, and it was Dahe herself who surfaced 50 yards down, alone, unaided, and crawled up on the gravel bar and lay there on her side with her hair across her face, breathing. Nobody helped her out. I want that in the record. 11 men were on that bank by then. 11, and every one of us went to the boy. I keep a ledger. I've done it since I was 19. It's a little pocket book, oilcloth cover, and in it I write down what I owe people and what people owe me, and I have never once collected on the second column. My wife, when I had one, said it was the most useless habit a man ever kept. Maybe. But I've got a bad memory for faces and a good one for debts, and I've found the world doesn't keep track on its own. That night I wrote, May 4 Ford, C. Mabry living, D-DOS tin box, deed inside, gone downstream. Nobody put a hand out to her. W. Prine did not put a hand out to her. I underlined my own name. I've never done that before or since. You want to know what a town is? A town is a thing that decides what it's going to feel before it feels it, and then feels that. By Sunday it was settled that the Ford had washed out because of the beaver dam upstream. By Monday it was settled that the beaver dam had been broken, deliberately, by somebody, to move water. And by Wednesday, in the Elk Horn and in Kessler's store and on the church steps, it was settled who. She had 80 acres up on Antelope Meadow. Eli Doss had proved it and filed it and died of a chest cold that turned into something worse, and she'd stayed on it 2 winters alone, and the meadow had the sagebrush spring on it. The only water above the cutthroat that ran in August, the only water that didn't quit, the only water that mattered in a dry year. And 1893 was going to be a dry year. Everybody with a nose could smell it. Harlan Buckhalter ran 9,000 head between the cutthroat and the purgatoire, and Harlan Buckhalter had been offering to buy that meadow for 2 years, and the price had been going down instead of up, which is how a certain kind of man tells you what he actually thinks of you. So the story went around town like this. She let the water go, to flood the low pasture, to spite the cattlemen, to drown a freighter's boy, some said, though that one didn't take even in bellwether, because Cully Mabry sat on the steps of the schoolhouse with a bandaged rib and told anybody who'd listen that the Indian lady picked up the whole entire wagon with her hands. Kids believe what their eyes tell them. It's a phase. I rode up to the meadow on the 9th of May because I owed her, and because I'm a coward who prefers to pay in private. She had a soddy with a plank front and a rail corral and 11 horses, which was 9 more than anybody in town knew about. Good horses. Not pretty, good. A blue roan with a chest like a church door. a little sorrel mare that watched me the whole way in with her ears up, the way a dog watches. Dahe was in the corral with her back to me, working a bays near hind, and she didn't turn around when my horse came up the trail. That's a thing about people who have had trouble. They know exactly how many hooves are behind them, and they don't spend the movement. "You're the farrier," she said. "Wendell Prine." "I know your name." She let the hoof down. "You watched." "I've had men break my nose, and it went easier." "I did," I said. She turned around then. She was maybe 35, maybe 45, one of those faces where the weather's done the aging instead of the years. There was a split across the bridge of her nose, healed badly, old. Her hands were wrapped in strips of a flour sack. "Then you know what I lost," she said. "The box. The paper in the box." I got down off my horse. "There'll be a copy in Trinidad at the land office." Eli filed at Trinidad. She went back to the bay's leg like the conversation was a chore she'd been assigned. Trinidad burned in '91, in the fall, 2 weeks after we buried him. The sun was very warm on my neck. Somewhere back of the soddy, a meadowlark was doing that liquid three-note thing they do, over and over, like a man practicing a phrase he can't get right. "Then the box was the only one," I said. "The box was the only one. And you knew that at the ford." She set the bay's foot down. She straightened up and looked at me, and I want you to understand that there was nothing brave in her face, nothing noble. She looked tired to death, and she looked, more than anything else, irritated, the way you look at a man who's arrived to admire a fire while your house is still in it. "Mr. Prine," she said, "there was a child under that wagon." "I know. You are asking me if I made a choice. I suppose I am." "Then you did not see it," she said. "There was no choice. There was only a boy and a box." She picked up her rasp. "The choice is what comes after. The choice is every day now." I want to tell you what she was like, and I keep failing, because the true things sound like praise, and she'd have hated praise. She was stubborn to the point of stupidity. I mean that. In June, when Buckhalter's man cut her drift fence and put 400 head across the meadow to eat it flat, she didn't shoot anybody and she didn't go to law. She got up at 3 in the morning and she moved 400 head of another man's cattle, alone, 7 miles down the Cutthroat Trail, and she pinned them in Buckhalter's own holding trap, and she wired the gate shut with his own wire, and she rode home and slept 2 hours and shot a horse. She never spoke about it. Buckhalter never spoke about it either, which is how I know it happened. She fidgeted with a bit of rawhide when she was thinking, rolled it between 2 fingers tight, then let it unroll. Her husband's, I think. She'd do it during the worst of what came later, sitting in that courtroom with her hands in her lap, rolling and unrolling a scrap of leather the size of a thumbnail, and it was the only part of her that ever showed anything. She laughed exactly twice in my hearing, once when my horse threw me in the corral, once at the end, and that one I'll get to. And she was kind, in a way that had no softness in it at all. She'd give you the last of her coffee and not say a word and not want to be thanked, and if you thanked her she'd look at you like you'd sneezed. The trouble came properly on the 21st of June. Vernon Salt was the county land agent and a small man in every way a man can be small. He rode up the meadow trail with 2 witnesses and a folded paper, and he read it to her from the saddle, which is a thing you do to a dog. The land was unpatented. There was no recorded deed. Eli Das had filed a homestead entry and died before final proof, and a widow could complete that proof, certainly, but the widow would have to be the widow. And where Salt wanted to know, unfolding his other paper, where was the marriage record? Trinidad, 1991, fall, ashes. "There's people alive who stood up at it," I said. "I'd ridden up that morning to reset a shoe, and I hadn't intended to speak at all. Reverend Corvin married them. He's in Pueblo now, but he's above ground." Salt looked at me, the way you look at a chair that's talked. "There is also," he said, The question of the woman's competency to hold under the statutes. He said it delicately like he was passing a plate. Her status. There is no allotment record, no agency role. As a legal matter, Mr. Prine, it is not entirely settled that she exists. I have replayed that afternoon many times, and there's a version where I get down off my horse and knock Vernon Salt into the dirt. In the real one, I said, that's a hell of a thing to say to a person standing in front of you. And Salt said, it's not personal, and that, I have come to believe, is the most personal sentence in the English language. The hearing was set for the 11th of August. Contest filed by H. Buckhalter, adjoining landholder, on grounds of abandonment and improper entry. 60 acres of the 80 were what he cared about, and the spring was in the middle of them, and everybody knew it and nobody said it. Dahay stood at her own door and listened to all of it, and when Salt had finished she said, "Get off my meadow." And Salt smiled and touched his hat and got off her meadow, because it cost him nothing to. The town, meanwhile, was busy being a town. Fen Mabry, whose son was alive, whose son ate breakfast every morning and complained about it, whose son had freckles like thrown gravel. Fen Mabry stood up at the Elk Horn on the 2nd of July and said he was not certain what he'd seen at the ford. He'd been in the willows. He'd been drowning. He'd heard tell the Doss woman was there, but he couldn't say she'd been the one. And anyhow the wagon had been settling on its own. And anyhow a body couldn't lift a tailgate, could they? So what were we even talking about? I was in that room. I'd like to tell you I stood up. I want to explain something. My whole living came out of that town. Every horse I shod belonged to a man in that room. I was 53 years old with a bad knee and a rented forge and no family, and the last of my money was in Kessler's till against a set of tools I'd ordered from Denver. I did not stand up. I went home and I opened the ledger and I wrote. July 2, Elk Horn, F. Mabry lied and I let him. Owed everything, paid nothing. Here's the part I've never told anybody. In late July, she came down off the meadow with the sorrel mare on a lead and stood outside my forge in the 90-degree heat and asked me what a horse like that was worth. I looked at the mare, 4 years old, clean-legged, eyes like a person's. 60, I said, 80 to the right man. And the roan? 125 and cheap. And all 11. I stopped working the bellows. Dahay. How much for all 11, Mr. Prine? You sell those horses, you've got no way to work that meadow. How much? I did the sum. I did it twice because I didn't want it to be true. 900 maybe. And a lawyer out of Denver, she said, is 1,500. The coals ticked. Outside, a wagon went by, and somebody laughed at something, and it was the most ordinary sound in the world. You've got the church, I said. Corvin'll come testify, that's free. He wrote me. She had the letter. She didn't take it out. He is 78 and he does not travel, and his memory, he says, is not what it was, and he is sorry. Then I have 11 horses and a spring and my husband in the ground on that meadow. She rolled the scrap of rawhide between her fingers, rolled and let it go. And Buckhalter has $40,000 and a lawyer already. I picked up the rasp and put it down. There's another way to look at it. Say it. He's offered you money 3 times, take it. Take his money, take your horses, go to Arizona, go anywhere. She was already shaking her head, and it wasn't stubbornness, or it wasn't only. Eli is on that meadow, she said, under the aspen at the north fence. I dug it. 3 days because the ground was frozen, and I dug it, and there was no one to help me, and when I finished I sat down in the snow and I could not remember his voice. She looked past me at the fire. If I sell, she said, then a man who called me nothing will own the ground where the only person who called me my name is lying, and in 10 years there will be a cattle chute on it. She put the rawhide in her pocket. So I will not sell, even if I lose. It is a stupid reason, and I know that it is stupid. I didn't say anything. You may say it's stupid, she said. It isn't stupid, I said, and my voice went somewhere on me. It's the only sensible thing I've heard all summer. She sold 9 of the 11. Kept the roan and a broken-down gray with a sway back that wasn't worth the shoeing. She got $740 because word had gotten around what she needed, and men who will pay full price to a stranger will haggle a widow to the bone if the widow's an Indian and the whole town knows she's losing. I bought the sorrel mare. I paid 90 and she told me I was a fool, and I told her I was a farrier and knew a good foot when I saw one, and I put the extra 30 in the bottom of her feed sack where she wouldn't find it till she was home. She found it that night and rode 9 miles back down in the dark to throw it at me. That's the truth. She threw money at me in the road at 11 o'clock at night and called me something in Apache that I've always assumed was not complimentary and rode away. Second time I ever heard her laugh was going to be at the courthouse. But I remember thinking, watching her go, that she'd been close to it right at the end, and that if you could get a laugh out of a woman in that position, then the rest of us had no excuse for anything. Now let me tell you about Ambrose Teague, and I'll tell you the way the town knew him in July, so you'll understand August. Teague ran the Ord and Teague outfit out of the high country west of the Divide, 22,000 acres of summer range, and he was, by anybody's arithmetic, the richest man within 200 miles. He was maybe 38, never married, never talked. He came into Bellwether 4 times a year for the bank and the mail, and he wore a coat that had been good 10 years ago and boots that had been good never. And he did not drink, and he did not tip his hat to women, and he shook hands like he was checking your pulse. Men said he was cold. Men said other things about a bachelor of 38 who kept to the mountain. He sold his beef to the same buyers as Buckhalter. He had range that touched Buckhalter's on the north. In a dry year, the two of them would be fighting over the same grass and the same water, and everybody expected that, whichever way the DAS hearing went, one of those two men was going to end up with the sagebrush spring. And on the 2nd of August, Ambrose Teague rode up Antelope Meadow, alone. I was there. I was setting a shoe on the swayback gray for free and lying about it. He came up the trail at a walk and he stopped 40 feet out, which is manners, out there. That's a man saying I am not going to come closer until you say so, and he sat his horse and said nothing at all. Dahay came out of the soddy with a rifle in the crook of her arm, not pointed, just present. Mr. Teague. Ma'am. The meadowlark was at it again, 3 notes, never 4. You'll want the spring, she said. Teague looked at the spring. It's a modest thing, honestly. A wet place under a rock shelf where the grass goes a violent green, and a trickle that runs down through the willows and doesn't quit, not in August, not ever. I've seen it, he said. Then you've seen it, you may go. And Ambrose Teague, the richest man in 3 counties, cold as a well chain, sat there another moment, and then said the only thing he said the whole visit. There's a hearing on the 11th. There is. I'll be there, he said. Then he turned his horse around and rode down off that meadow, and neither of us said a word for a long time. And finally Dahay lowered the rifle and looked at me, and there was something in her face I hadn't seen before and couldn't name. I named it later, and it was worse than fear. It was hope, and she'd been trying not to have any. The night of the 10th of August, I couldn't sleep. I got up and I lit the lamp and I opened the ledger and I read it from the front, 29 years of it. Every man who'd ever done me a turn, everyone I'd shorted. It's a hell of a document. It's the only thing I own that's worth anything. And I thought about 11 men on a riverbank walking to a boy. And I thought about Fen Mabry standing up in the Elk Horn, and how his hands had been shaking, and how nobody had made him do it, and how he'd have done anything, rather than admit to that room that he owed his son's life to a woman they'd all agreed didn't exist. That's what a debt does when you won't pay it. It doesn't disappear. It turns into hate. It has to go somewhere. I sat there till the lamp guttered. Then I turned to a clean page and I wrote out in as plain a hand as I've got exactly what I saw on the 4th of May at the Cutthroat Ford. The wagon, the tailgate, the box with EDOS on the lid going down the current with the deed inside it, her hands, the 8 inches, the boy. I signed it and I dated it and I put on my coat, and then I sat back down. Because here's the thing, nobody tells you about doing right. I knew what that page cost. Ott Renwick's mules, Buckhalter's remuda 40 head twice a year, Kessler's credit, every hand at every outfit in the valley, and me 53 with a knee that wouldn't take another winter of standing. And I sat in that chair for 2 hours with my coat on, and the paper in my hand, and I did not go. I want to be honest with you. I have been honest with you the whole way. I did not go that night. At 6 in the morning I saddled the sorrel mare, her sorrel mare, the one I'd bought with money I'd meant as charity and been shamed for, and I rode into Bellwether, where they were already lined up outside the courthouse 2 hours before the doors opened, because there's nothing a town loves like watching a thing it's already decided. And Ambrose Teague's horse was tied at the rail. And that's when it started. The courthouse in Bellwether was a converted Grange Hall with a stove in it that nobody had thought to take out. And by 9 o'clock on the 11th of August, there were 60 people in a room built for 40, and that stove standing in the middle of us all like a black joke. I got a seat because I got there first. 3rd row aisle. I had my coat on in 90-degree heat because the page was in the inside pocket, and I could feel the corner of it against my ribs every time I breathed, and I remember thinking, this is what a stone in your boot is like, if the stone is your own character. Cully Mabry was there, sitting up front with his mother, no bandage anymore, a boy again, kicking the chair leg in front of him until she put a hand on his knee. Alive in the ordinary way that alive people are, which is to say without any sense at all of what it costs. Buckhalter came in at 10 past, and men moved to give him room without being asked. He had his lawyer with him, a soft man from Pueblo named Dunwoody who wore a collar in that heat and never once sweated, which I've always taken as evidence of something. Vernon Salt sat at the front table with the register, a bald and careful old man named Halloway who'd come down from the Denver office and who looked, from the moment he sat, like a man who'd already read everything and would rather be fishing. And at 18 minutes past 10 Dahe came in. She'd walked 9 miles in a black dress that had been her wedding dress and had been dyed since, and she'd walked it because she'd sold the horses. Her boots were white with dust to the ankle. She came up the aisle and there was that sound a room makes, not silence, worse than silence, the sound of 60 people deciding to look somewhere else at the same time. She sat down alone at a table with no lawyer at it. She put her hands in her lap. And she took out the scrap of rawhide and began to roll it between 2 fingers and let it go, and roll it again. Dunwoody made his case in 40 minutes, and I'll give it to you in 4. There was no recorded patent on the 80 acres at Antelope Meadow. There was a homestead entry filed by one Elias Das in 1888, requiring 5 years' residence and final proof, and Elias Das had died in the 4th year. A widow may complete an entry, certainly. The statute is generous. But where was the record of the marriage? Trinidad, said Dunwoody, with a small, regretful gesture, was ashes. And a woman may say she is a wife. Any woman may say it. In the absence of a record, we have only the word of the claimant, and the word of the claimant is, here he paused, and did not look at her, and set it to the ceiling of a character difficult to weigh. And further, the claimant was of the Chiricahua. She appeared on no agency roll, held no allotment, had never been enumerated. She was, in the strict sense in which the land laws must be read, not a person capable of holding. Not, Dunwoody said, a person capable. He said it twice, he liked it. And finally there was the matter of abandonment, and of the beaver dam above the ford, and Dunwoody would show, He did not say prove, he said show. Which is a lawyer telling you he's about to sell you something. That on the night of the 3rd of May, the claimant had gone up the cutthroat and had let out water that drowned a freight wagon and near drowned a child. The room made a sound then, a low one. Dahe rolled the rawhide and let it go. They called Fen Mabry at 11. I have known Fen 20 years. He is not a bad man. That's important. Nearly everything terrible I have ever seen was done by men who were not bad, and if you don't understand that, you'll spend your life waiting for the villain and never notice the room. He took the stand with his hat in both hands, and he answered Dunwoody in a voice I could barely hear. Had he seen a woman at the ford? He had heard it said. Had he seen her? He was in the willows. He was drowning, he couldn't say. Was it possible, Dunwoody asked it gently, kindly, the way you hold a door, was it possible that the claimant had been upstream that morning, coming down, from the direction, say, of the Beaver Dam? And Fen Mabry looked up. And he looked at his son in the front row, and his son looked back at him with his mouth a little open, and Fen Mabry said, She come down off the ridge, that's the trail from the dam. That's all he said. He didn't lie. He never said one word that was false. He just laid a true thing down at an angle and let the room fall over it. He got off the stand and he walked past her table, and she did not look up at him, and he sat down next to Cully, and the boy moved away from him. 6 inches. Nothing. A child sliding an inch or two down a bench. I have never seen a man's face do what Fen Mabry's face did in that moment. Holloway asked at noon if the claimant wished to present witnesses. Dahe stood up. She was very calm. She said she had no lawyer and no witnesses, and that Reverend Corvin, who married her, was 78 and could not travel, and that she had a letter from him which she supposed was worth nothing. And Holloway said, not unkindly, that a letter was hearsay, and she said, yes, that is what I supposed. And she said, I have lived on that ground 4 years. I have dug the well and built the corral, and my husband is buried at the north fence. I did not touch the dam. I would not know how. On the morning of the 4th of May, I was on the ridge because I had been at the Fenwick place shoeing horses for money, and I came down and I went into the river. Why? Said Holloway. Because there was a boy under the wagon. Nobody laughed. It was worse. Nobody did anything at all. There was that shuffle, that little collective adjustment of shoulders and boots, the sound of 60 people declining to believe something in unison. Dunwoody rose and said, mildly, that no one disputed the claimant's version of her own courage. And Dahe said, You dispute my existence, sir. My courage seems small next to it. Holloway looked at her over his spectacles for a moment. Then he wrote something down. I had the page in my pocket. I want you to know how close it was. My hand was inside the coat. I had it between 2 fingers. Holloway said, Is there any other person? And looked at the room and looked at the room. And there was a moment, 3 seconds, 4, where the only thing in the world was the corner of that paper against my thumb and the smell of hot pine and 60 men breathing. And I thought about Ott Renwick's mules and Buckhalter's, Remuda and Kessler's till. And I did not stand. I have written that sentence 4 times in my life, and it does not get shorter. Ambrose Teague stood up in the back of the room. He hadn't taken a seat. He'd been standing at the wall the whole time with his hat in his hand, and the reason nobody had marked him is that Teague was the kind of man a room forgets on purpose. And now, he stood off that wall and every head turned, and the temperature of the place changed the way it does before weather. Holloway said, Sir. And Ambrose Teague said, in a flat, unhurried voice with no more feeling in it than a man reading a brand, I was a witness at that wedding. 7 words. I have thought about them for 31 years. I'll tell you what the room did, because it did something ugly, and then it did something worse. First it laughed. A short bark of it from over by the window, somebody who thought Teague was making a joke, because a man like Teague standing up for a woman like her could only be a joke. Then Teague turned his head and looked at whoever it was, and the laugh stopped like a chicken's neck. And then the room went absolutely silent, and in the silence it began, all 60 of us at once, to understand. Because we all knew Ambrose Teague. We knew he did not lie. We knew he did not speak, which is a different and more valuable thing. And we knew, every one of us knew, the second he said it, that this had been true the entire time, that it had been true in May when the water took her deed, true in June when Salt read the paper at her from a saddle, true in July when Finn Mabry stood up in the Elk Horn, and true when she sold 9 horses to men who haggled her down, and true when she walked 9 miles in her wedding dress in the dust because she had nothing left to ride. The proof had been sitting on a mountain the whole summer. Dunwoody came apart very slowly, like a wet paper sack. You, sir, you understand this is under oath. I do. You claim to have been present at a marriage in Trinidad Inn. In April of '88, at the Methodist Church, at 4 in the afternoon, and it was raining, and Eli Doss signed with a mark because he had a broken hand from a horse, and I signed my own name under his. Teague hadn't moved from where he stood. And the second witness was a woman named Ottilie Prather that kept the boarding house, and I don't know where she is, and Reverend Corvin's hand shook and he spilled the ink. There is a species of silence that is heavier than a full room. Holloway said, "Mr. Teague, do you have anything in writing?" And Ambrose Teague reached inside his coat. He kept a tally book. Of course he did. Every cattleman keeps a tally book, weights and brands and dates, the small, remorseless arithmetic of a life in beef. And Teague had kept his in the same coat pocket for 11 years, and folded into the back of it, soft as cloth from being carried, was the witness's copy of a marriage certificate dated the 19th of April, 1888. He'd been given it at the church. He'd put it in his book. He had never once taken it out, because there had never once been a reason, because in 11 years no living soul had thought to walk up that mountain and ask Ambrose Teague what he knew about the woman on Antelope Meadow. He handed it to Holloway. Holloway read it twice. He took his spectacles off and he put them back on, and he read it a third time, and then he looked out at the room over the top of them, and I have never in my life seen contempt worn so lightly by a public official. "Mr. Dunwoody," he said, "do you wish to examine the witness?" And Dunwoody, who had never sweated, sweated. I want to slow down here, because what happened next is the part everybody in Bellwether tells wrong, and they tell it wrong in her favor, which is the most insulting way to be told wrong. They say she wept, she didn't. They say she thanked him. She never spoke to Ambrose Teague that day, not once, not a word, and he never looked at her, and I don't believe those 2 people exchanged 50 sentences in the whole of their acquaintance. What she did was this. She sat very still with her hands in her lap, and she stopped rolling the rawhide. That's all. She just stopped. And I looked at her hands and understood that for 3 months, every hour of every day, some part of that woman had been holding on with 2 fingers to a scrap of leather that had belonged to a dead man, and now she had let go of it, and her hands were just hands, open in her lap and useless. That's what winning looked like on her. It looked like exhaustion, arriving 4 years late. The rest is procedure, and I'll be quick. Dunwoody could not shake Teague. Nobody living could shake Teague. He asked why the witness had not come forward sooner, and Teague said, "Nobody asked me," and Dunwoody said, "Nobody asked you," in a rising voice like he'd caught something, and Teague looked at him for what felt like a week and said, "No." The Beaver Dam collapsed as an argument when Holloway asked Dunwoody to produce the man who'd seen it broken, and Dunwoody produced, instead, a great deal of language. The competency question Holloway ruled on from the bench, and I'll set his words down as near as I can get them, that the claimant was the lawful widow of a qualified entryman, that her residence and improvements were undisputed by any witness the contestant had bothered to bring. and that the register of this office declined to be the first authority in the territory, to hold that a woman who has proved up 80 acres alone through 2 winters is legally incapable of owning them. He said the contest was dismissed. He said final proof would be received in the ordinary course. He said this hearing is closed, and he took his spectacles off and folded them and looked, more than anything else, tired. And Harlan Buckhalter, who had come to take a spring and had lost, stood up and crossed the room to her table and put out his hand and said, "No hard feelings, ma'am. Business." And Dahe looked at that hand. And she laughed. It was the second time I ever heard it, and I hope to God it's the last. It was one syllable. It came out of her like something dislodged. It was not bitter and it was not cruel, and there was, I swear to you, a kind of awful delight in it. The delight of a person who has just been shown the exact size and shape of the world she lives in and finds it, at long last, funny. She didn't take his hand. She stood up and walked out of that room into the light, and she started walking home. 9 miles in the dust, in her wedding dress. Nobody offered her a ride. Not one man in that town, not after all of it, not even then. That's the part I'd cut, if I were making it up. Fen Mabry caught her in the street. I was 20 feet back and I heard all of it, and I've never repeated it until now. He got in front of her with his hat in his hands and he said her name. He said Mrs. Doss, which none of them ever had, and he said, "I seen you. At the ford. I seen you lift it." She stopped walking. "I seen the box go," he said. "I seen you look at it and let it go. And I have laid awake every night since May, and I want you to know that I'd have said so. Today, if it come down to it, if Teague hadn't have stood up, I'd have said so." And I believe he believed that. I want to be fair to him. I think in the hot little furnace of his heart Fen Mabry truly believed that he would have stood up 2 minutes later and told the truth and saved her, and that his cowardice was therefore only a near miss, a thing that had almost not happened. Dahe looked at him for a while. Then she said, "Your son moved away from you on the bench." Fen Mabry made a sound. "He is 11, she said. "He will forgive you. He will be a man in 7 years, and he will have made his own arrangements with himself, and he will not remember it." She started walking again. "I will remember it, Mr. Mabry. That is the whole of what I have to say to you. Somebody had to." I caught up with her at the edge of town. I had the sorrel mare, her sorrel mare, and I was going to offer it, and I wanted understood that I would have walked back myself and been glad to. But I had the page out first. Somehow the page was in my hand before the reins were. 4 folded sheets, everything I saw at the ford, the tailgate, the 8 inches, the gold letters going down the brown water, signed and dated the night of the 10th of August at some hour when a braver man would have been on a horse. I held it out to her. "I wrote it down," I said. "That night I meant to read it in the room. I had it on me the whole." "But you didn't." "No." She didn't take the paper. She didn't even look at it. She looked at my face, and the sun was going down behind the ridge, and the light was that terrible gold you get in a dry August, and she said, "Mr. Prine, you keep a book of what you owe." "I do." "And you never collect the other side." "No." "Then you have understood only half of it." She reached out and she pushed my hand, not roughly, the way you'd move a branch out of a doorway, so that the paper went back toward my chest. "A debt is not a thing you carry so it can be heavy. It is a thing you pay. Today it was $5, and it would have taken you 1 minute, and you did not spend it." I stood there in the road with my mouth open. "Keep your page," she said. "It's your ledger, it was never mine." And she took the sorrel mare's reins out of my hand, because she was tired, and the mare was hers by every law but paper, and she was not a fool. And she got up on that horse in her black dyed wedding dress and rode home to her meadow, and I walked 9 miles in the dark thinking about the difference between guilt and payment, which is a distance considerably longer than 9 miles. Now the last thing. The thing they never tell in Bellwether because it doesn't fit. August of '93 turned into the driest September anybody had seen. The cutthroat ran clear and thin, and then it ran in places, and then it stopped running. The grass went the color of a saddle. By the 20th of September there was no water above the ford, none, not a hole, not a seep, except one violent green place under a rock shelf on Antelope Meadow. Buckhalter had 4,000 head on the flat below. They started dying on the 22nd. You could hear it from the trail. That's a sound I won't describe. On the 24th, Harlan Buckhalter rode up the meadow trail alone with his hat in his hand, and I happened to be there, shoeing the roan, and I have never enjoyed anything in my life the way I intended to enjoy the next 10 minutes. I didn't. He stopped 40 feet out. He'd learned that much, and he could not get the words out. He tried 3 times. What he finally said was, "I got no right to ask." And Dahe said, "No." And she opened the gate. Just that. She walked over and unwired the drift gate she'd rebuilt in June and swung it back and stood aside. And Buckhalter's cattle came up that draw in a brown river and stuck their faces in her spring. And she stood there and watched them tear up the green grass around it with their feet. They ruined it. You understand that. 4,000 head on a wet place will destroy it. The willows went. The grass went. The seep silted, and it did not run clean again for 2 years, and it never ran the way it had. She gave away the only thing she had that anybody wanted, 3 weeks after killing herself to keep it, to a man who had tried to take it, and it cost her more than losing the hearing would have. Afterward, Buckhalter tried to pay her. She said, and I heard this, "I was standing at the corral rail with a rasp in my hand for the second time in my life, while something enormous happened in front of me, and I said nothing," she said. "They are only cows, Mr. Buckhalter. They did not decide anything." I asked her about it later that fall. I'd got the nerve. I asked her why, and I made a mess of the asking, and what I meant was, why give it to them? Why give anything to them? Why not let them come to you on their knees every dry year from now until the end of the world? She was mending a hackamore. She didn't stop. "At the ford," she said, "you asked me if I chose between the boy and the box. I remember. I told you there was no choice, and you thought I was being modest, and I was not." She pulled the knot down. "A choice is when you can imagine yourself doing the other thing. I could not imagine it. That is not virtue, Mr. Prine. It is only what I am. It is not any more praiseworthy than the color of my hand." She held it up, looked at it, put it back to the leather. "But the gate," she said, "I could imagine leaving shut. I imagined it all night. I imagined it very clearly, and I wanted it." She tightened the knot. "That one was the choice, and it did not feel good, and no one thanked me, and I do not think I am any better than I was on Tuesday." The meadowlark was still at it. 3 notes over and over all that autumn, never 4. "They will still call me what they call me," she said. "I know. They already are." She snapped the end off with her teeth. "It only means now that they are lying." Ambrose Teague came up the meadow one time that I know of in November, and brought her a horse. A blue roan colt out of his own stud, 3 years old, not broke. He didn't get down. He put the lead rope over the rail, and he said, "Wanted a home," which was a lie so bad and so kind that I laughed out loud. She said, "I can't pay for it." And he said, "Didn't say you could," and rode off down the trail. And that is the last time I ever saw those 2 people in the same square mile. And if you're hopping for more than that, I'm sorry, but this is the true one. She held Antelope Meadow 11 more years. I don't know what happened after that, and I'll tell you plainly why. In the spring of 1904, a man came up from the Indian office in Santa Fe with a leather case and a list, because there was a roll being made at last, and being on a roll turns out to be a different thing from existing, and the difference cost her. But I was gone by then. My knee finished me in '99. I sold the forge and went to my sister in Lamar, and I never went back, and the last letter I had from Dahe Das was 3 lines long and did not complain about anything, which was like her. And it ended by asking after my horses, which was also like her. I still have the page. I never gave it to anybody. It's in the back of the ledger with 29 years of debts I never collected, and every so often I take it out and read it, and it is exactly as true as it was the night I wrote it, and exactly as worthless. That's the thing she was trying to tell me in the road, and it took me the rest of my life to hear it. A man can keep the most beautiful record in the county of everything he owes, and never once put $1 on the table. There's an old woman in the ground under an aspen at the north fence line now, I expect. 2 graves. One dug in frozen ground by a woman who couldn't remember her husband's voice, and one dug by somebody else, and I don't know by who, and I hope to God they had help. The town says now that they always knew she was a good woman. They say it easily. They say it the way you say the weather. And the last time I was in Bellwether at the Elk Horn, a young man I didn't know told me the whole story wrong. Told me she'd wept in the courtroom. Told me Teague had loved her. Told me the town had carried her home on their shoulders. And he told it beautifully, and every man in the room nodded. And I sat there with my hat in my hands and my ledger in my coat. And I didn't say a word. I'm told it's a habit of mine.